What if I told you that the modern concept of race wasn't actually born out of, ancient tribal hatreds, but was basically invented to balance a colonial spreadsheet?
It sounds wild, I know.
Yeah, right. Like, if you're listening to this, you probably assume that deep-seated racial prejudice created the Atlantic slave trade. But today, we're going to look at evidence suggesting it was kind of the exact opposite.
Exactly.
We're doing a deep dive into how the world's two largest faiths, so Christianity and Islam, encountered the exact same ancient system of human bondage, but took radically divergent paths based on the economic demands of their times.
Right. And we are pulling this from a single, really deeply analytical source today. It's an article titled How Slaves Were Treated, Atlantic Chattel V.S. Islamic Laws, and it's written by Mark Wells on the platform Knowledge is King.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read.
It really is. The author meticulously breaks down how economic needs and early concepts of social Darwinism transformed the Atlantic trade into this system of permanent biological categorization, while the Islamic system utilized what he calls a contractual model.
So our mission today is to objectively unpack the historical arguments that Wells presents. We really want to understand the actual mechanisms, the how and the why behind these two massive historical trajectories.
But before we step into the timeline, let's establish the ground rules for this analysis, because we are dealing with global history, theology, and obviously the deeply traumatic reality of human bondage.
Right. It's heavy stuff.
Very heavy. So our role here is strictly as historical analysts. We are not here to debate the absolute morality of these eras. We're not taking sides, and we're certainly not endorsing specific theological viewpoints.
Exactly.
Our focus is entirely on, impartially unpacking the historical trajectory, the legal frameworks, and the societal mechanisms exactly as they're outlined by the author of our source text.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the shared foundation. Because both Christianity and Islam entered a world where human bondage was already a normalized, deeply entrenched reality.
Yeah, the ancient world essentially ran on it.
Right. It's important to understand for context that neither faith introduced the concept of slavery. They inherited it.
And the paradox at the heart of Wells's article is really how these faiths subsequently molded that inheritance.
Because they both start with these messages of liberation, right?
Exactly. The author points out that the sheer mechanized brutality of the Atlantic slave trade seems entirely divorced from the original vision of Jesus, or Isa, as he is known in Islam.
Yeah.
The teachings of Jesus were fundamentally centered on uplifting the marginalized, the least of these.
And to be fair, the article also doesn't shy away from the reality of the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah.
It explicitly notes that the Islamic impact on the Arab and trans-Saharan trade was still an extractive and often harsh system. So we're not doing a comparison between a dystopia and a utopia here.
No, not at all. Slavery is intrinsically coercive no matter the system. But the core divergence between these two historical trajectories lies in how they legally and socially classified the enslaved individual over time.
Right.
We are essentially tracking a transition from a system defined by religious identity to one defined by racial identity.
A good way to visualize this structural difference, I think, is to look at it like resource management.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, the Atlantic system developed into something resembling a strip mining operation.
Yeah.
Extract maximum labor from a non-renewable biological input until it's depleted.
Right.
While the Islamic model, as described in the text, functioned more like an indentured integration pipeline.
An integration pipeline. Okay, I like that.
Like extracting labor, sure, but maintaining a legal framework to eventually absorb that person into the broader society. They're like two different architects being handed the exact same flawed foundation. But because of the specific demands of their clients, in this case, economics and societal structure, one builds a factory and the other builds a transit station.
That's a really stark contrast.
Right. So I have to ask, if both faiths started with spiritual principles, how exactly did the Atlantic system completely bypass the teachings of Jesus in favor of a brutal philosophy?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the author provides a specific timeline for this. It didn't just happen overnight. He describes the ideological machinery of the Atlantic trade as pre-Darwinian Darwinism.
Pre-Darwinian Darwinism. That's a heavy phrase.
It is, because we generally associate ideas of biological hierarchy and the survival of the fittest with Charles Darwin, right? And he didn't publish his theories until 1859.
Yeah, exactly.
But the architects of the Atlantic trade were implementing a proto-Darwinian mindset centuries earlier, and it was out of pure economic necessity.
Wait, really? Just economics?
Yeah, they faced a massive structural problem. They had to reconcile the universal love of Christ with the high profit demands of chattel slavery in the Americas.
Because the New World had essentially infinite land, but zero labor to work it. Yeah.
Precisely. The colonial powers wanted to extract as much wealth from sugar, tobacco, and eventually cotton as fast as humanly possible.
And to do that, you need bodies. You need a massive workforce.
Right, but the initial colonial laws had this glaring loophole for a labor-intensive agricultural economy. In the early days of European colonialism, the distinction between master and slave was primarily religious, not racial.
Oh, right. So it was about theology.
Exactly. A heathen. So someone who wasn't Christian could theoretically be enslaved. But crucially, if that person converted to Christianity and was baptized, they were supposed to be freed.
Because the prevailing theology dictated that you couldn't enslave a fellow brother or sister in Christ.
Right. But you can see how that religious loophole quickly became an economic disaster for plantation owners.
I mean, yeah. If all it took to lose your entire capital investment, your whole workforce, was a baptism.
Your agricultural empire would collapse overnight.
Right.
The system just couldn't survive if salvation equaled emancipation.
So what did they do? Did the colonial governments just, change the law?
They did exactly that. They systematically severed the link between baptism and freedom. The state and the church worked in tandem to ensure that religious conversion no longer granted liberty.
Wait, so the theology actually followed the economics?
Yes.
That completely flips the common understanding of history on its head. I mean, the architects of the Atlantic system didn't use a pre-existing concept of biological racism to justify a new economic model.
No, they didn't.
They effectively invented the rigid structures of race because the economics of the New World demanded a permanent, non-renewable labor force that couldn't just, pray its way out of bondage.
Exactly. The focus had to be shifted away from the soul because the soul can be saved and transformed, right?
Right.
They had to shift it to the skin, which is permanent and hereditary. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, theologians and plantation owners actively reinterpreted biblical texts to serve this new legal reality.
This is where the curse of Ham comes in, right?
Yes, exactly. They utilized the story of the curse of Ham from the Bible, claiming that Africans were descendants of Noah's son Ham and were therefore divinely destined for perpetual servitude.
So they literally rewrote the theology to protect the profit margins.
Yeah.
I mean, a faith originally rooted in liberation was retrofitted into a tool for biological categorization. That is dark.
It is. And it ties directly into industrialization. The Atlantic slave trade was the first system to truly utilize the mechanisms of industrial capitalism on a global scale.
Right.
And in a strictly capitalist framework, survival of the fittest is measured in profit margins, yield, and efficiency.
So to maximize those margins, the input in this agricultural machine had to be reduced to a tool.
Exactly.
And that is where the term chattel slavery comes from, isn't it? Chattel shares a linguistic root with cattle.
Yes, it does.
The human being is legally redefined as livestock.
Right. Because the original teachings of Jesus became a tangible obstacle to industrial efficiency. You cannot efficiently extract labor to the point of death if your societal framework insists that the laborer is your spiritual equal and deserving of charity.
No, obviously not.
So an entirely new hierarchy of humanity was required to solve this spreadsheet problem. By the time the 19th century arrived, social Darwinism didn't actually invent anything new.
Right.
It simply provided a secular scientific vocabulary for the dehumanization that had already been codified by the church and state centuries earlier.
The system literally altered the definition of a human being to balance a ledger.
It really did.
But, okay, if the profit motive was powerful enough to invent racial categories in the Americas, we have to look at the other side of the article's paradox.
Let's do it.
Why didn't that exact same profit motive corrupt the Islamic world in the same way? The text describes a contractual nature to the Islamic model. What does that actually mean?
Well, the Islamic system functioned under a fundamentally different legal and social architecture. While the Atlantic model created a permanent biological state to serve industrial capitalism, Islamic law treated slavery as a transient legal state.
Transient, meaning the condition of being enslaved was temporary, or at least inherently changeable, rather than an immutable trait you were born with.
Exactly. And the foundational difference lies in how the religion codified the spiritual status of the individual, and crucially, how that codification was enforced by medieval courts.
Okay, enforced how?
Well, The Quran and the Hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, explicitly emphasize that the master and the slave are entirely equal in the eyes of God.
Okay, so what does this all mean? I have to push back on this a little bit, just based on the author's own admissions. Wells notes that the Arab and trans-Saharan trade was still an extractive and often harsh system.
Yeah.
So how did this concept of spiritual equality actually manifest in daily life?
That's a very fair question.
Right, because if someone is forced into labor, knowing their master views them as spiritually equal doesn't change the fact that they are still enslaved. Did it actually change anything, or was it just lip service?
The article argues it wasn't just lip service, and the reason is that spiritual equality was baked directly into the legal framework of the state.
Okay.
Because both parties were viewed as spiritually equal, it created this massive society-wide moral pressure toward manumission, which in Arabic is known as ithu.
Right.
Freeing a slave was characterized in the text as an act of high piety.
Oh, so it was a mechanism for a believer to atone for their sins. Like if someone broke an oath or missed a religious obligation, freeing an enslaved person was the prescribed spiritual remedy.
Yes. And the author details specific, tangible mechanisms that made this legal pathway a reality, because it wasn't just left entirely to the goodwill or the guilt of the master.
Right, because relying on goodwill in an extractive system rarely works out.
Exactly. The most defining feature of the system's legalism was the mukataba. This was a formal, written contract where an enslaved person could legally agree upon a price to buy their own liberty.
Okay, but let's look at the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm an enslaved person, I'm entirely dependent on my master. I don't have independent wealth.
Right.
So how am I supposed to afford to buy my own freedom? A contract isn't useful if the price is literally impossible to meet.
Well, that's the genius of the legal framework. Once a mukataba contract was signed, it was legally binding in Islamic courts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the master could not arbitrarily dissolve it. And from that point, the enslaved person had the legal right to earn money independently and keep those earnings to pay off their freedom.
Wait, really? So they could participate in the market?
Yes. And the broader community was actively encouraged through zakat, which is mandatory religious charity, to help enslaved people pay off these specific contracts.
No way.
Yeah, the state itself sometimes even utilized public funds to facilitate these manumissions.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I mean, thinking back to the analogy from earlier, the Islamic legalistic approach basically built a functional ladder out of the institution.
A ladder, yes.
Compare that to the Atlantic system, which spent centuries actively passing laws to kick that exact same ladder away. Changing the rules around baptism specifically to ensure no one could ever climb out.
Exactly. And because the Islamic system maintained that legal ladder, it resulted in a wildly different landscape of social mobility. In the Islamic world, an enslaved person was not permanently reduced to livestock.
Right.
Their intellect, their administrative capabilities, and their military prowess were still recognized by the state apparatus.
And the text points to the Mamluk Sultanate as like the ultimate manifestation of this mobility, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. The Mamluks were a class of enslaved soldiers, primarily of Turkic or Caucasian origin, and they were utilized heavily in Egypt and the Levant.
Okay.
Because their skills were valued and because their status as slaves did not strip them of human agency under the law, they were integrated deeply into the military and political hierarchy.
But mechanically, how does an enslaved class take over an entire empire? That seems like a massive contradiction to me.
How so?
Well, if you hand an enslaved population weapons and political influence, wouldn't they just immediately rebel and dismantle the system?
Well, they didn't dismantle the system, they became the system.
Wow.
Historically, whoever controls the military apparatus eventually controls the state. Because Islamic law permitted enslaved individuals to bear arms, hold administrative office, and command armies, things that, let's remember, were strictly illegal for enslaved people in the Atlantic system.
Completely illegal.
Right. So the Mamluks consolidated military power. They eventually deposed their rulers and established their own dynasty. Enslaved people became the generals, the advisors, and the absolute rulers of Egypt for hundreds of years.
That is just mind-blowing. I mean, you cannot imagine an enslaved person on a Virginia sugar plantation in the 1700s being legally permitted to lead the colonial militia, let alone becoming the governor.
No, absolutely not.
The Atlantic system was biologically and legally engineered to make that impossible.
And the treatment of descendants also highlights the divergence here. Because the status of slavery in the Islamic framework was a transient legal state and not a permanent racial identity, the descendants of slaves were incredibly fluid within the society.
Right, they weren't marked forever.
Exactly. The author notes they were often absorbed entirely into the general population within a generation or two. There was no permanent, visibly marked underclass that persisted for centuries after the institution itself was abolished.
So, synthesizing the historical arguments from Mark Wells's article, the divergent impacts of these two systems really just boil down to a structural conflict between integration and segregation.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
The Atlantic model, driven by the intense economic pressures of industrial capitalism, required humans to be reduced to non-human inputs. It transformed a faith rooted in liberation into a sophisticated framework of biological categorization just to protect an agricultural spreadsheet.
While the Islamic model, dealing with the exact same human institution of bondage, maintained a strict legalistic path. By recognizing the spiritual equality of the individual, the system provided distinct contractual mechanisms, like the mukataba, for their eventual integration and allowed for significant social elevation.
This historical deep dive shows us the profound and honestly sometimes terrifying power of economic incentives. Understanding how the modern concept of race was essentially manufactured to justify a colonial labor model proves that the relentless pursuit of profit can force a society to completely rewrite its most sacred theological beliefs.
It's sobering.
It really is. It can convince an entire civilization to classify human beings as tools. Alternatively, legal structures that maintain the fundamental agency of the individual, even within an unequal system, can preserve pathways for human integration.
It just demonstrates that societal and moral frameworks are often highly malleable when subjected to the needs of a market.
Which leaves you with a necessary final thought to consider. If the relentless pursuit of profit in the Industrial Revolution was enough to make society quietly invent racial categorization and rewrite its theology just to justify treating humans as inputs and tools, what modern foundational beliefs might we be quietly rewriting right now to serve today's economic margins? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep asking those big questions.